After 5 years of Michael Schumacher winning world championships, it would be all change in 2005, and that became clear from the very first weekend of the new season, when qualifying gave us a mixed up grid and Giancarlo Fisichella got to deliver on Renault's pre-season promise by taking victory and getting to celebrate the win on the same day for the first time in his career. Fernando Alonso capped a great day for Renault with a charging drive from deep in the field to claim a podium. Red Bull Racing made an excellent first impression on its F1 debut, while Michael Schumacher had a weekend to forget in what would soon become a season to forget. And in classic F1 fashion, there were huge political battles going on off-track, with everyone seemingly at war with somebody else behind the scenes, and the FIA trying to keep a lid on everything. So joining me, Glenn Freeman, to look back at the 2005 Australian Grand Prix, we have Mark Hughes and Matt Beer. Mark, you were in Australia for this weekend, so tell us, when you think back to the 2005 season opener, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
First thing that comes to mind is it was an awful long time ago, because I really had to think quite hard. And then when I started reading up on it, I think, oh yeah, it started triggering some things. And I think the thing that most stood out for me was that first qualifying session, which began sort of dryish and got progressively wetter. And so because it was the first weekend of the twin qualifying sessions on separate days with the amalgamated time, it became very apparent very quickly that the gaps were so big because of the change in track conditions that this essentially was going to be the grid. And so the fatal flaw in the new system was revealed immediately. And there was a certain humour in that. And I think that's is it dawned on everyone. I think, hang on, you're never going to find 5 seconds to move up one grid position tomorrow, are they? So, that it was that really. I think it was the standout memory of that particular occasion.
Yeah, aggregate qualifying falls on its face immediately. Now, Matt, the main reason you're here with us, other than being a Bring Back V10s regular, is that you backed this race when it was nominated by one of our members on Patreon, RG. What happened was lots of us all picked races to get behind that our members had nominated. We then put it out to a vote, and it was your choice that won. And I can reveal it won by 2 votes. Out of hundreds and hundreds of votes, it won by 2 over Michael Schumacher's first Ferrari win in 1996. So why did you get behind RG's nomination for Australia 2005?
Probably because someone else had already taken Barcelona 96 before I got there. Because that. But the thing is, what made me jump on this, and also I advocated 2005 for the revisited vote that went to 93 with Ed's campaigning instead. So often, when you offer the list around of episodes, I jump on the ones that I loved as a teenager, the seasons I was really obsessed by. And by 2005, I was like in a different place in my career and F1 fandom. And my memory of 2005 isn't like loads of detail about every race. It's loads of snippets that made me think, that must have been great seeing the Ferrari dominance end in such a mixed up, surprising way. And there were lots of elements of 2005, which I know were rubbish, not changing tyres for a whole race, how heavily engine penalties mixed things up, aggregate qualifying being a terrible idea that, like Mark said, instantly failed. But the result was a championship that was actually so much more open than we'd seen in 2004, particularly, and races that were full of surprises. So even though the route to an entertaining season was rubbish, we got an entertaining season. And the more I kind of thought about this race, I remembered so many bits I loved about it, like the mixed up grid and Fisichella's win. And there were so many things I'd forgotten as well. So it's a rare chance for me to actually relive something as if I'm experiencing it partly for the first time, which I don't often get on V10s. Normally I'm like, oh yeah, here's the race I can remember every single lap of from when I was 15.
Yeah, different experience this time. I really like the 2005 season. Maybe that is just because after a lot of red success in the first half of the 2000s, we had a change. So let's talk about some of that red success, shall we, to kick things off? Because after absolutely dominating in 2004, Ferrari decided to start the following year with an interim car dubbed the F2004M to give it more time to develop its definitive machine for 2005. Ferrari was hoping that the 2004 M would be competitive enough to get it through the first 4 races, but if that wasn't the case, it could bring forward the F2005's debut to round 3 in Bahrain. Michael Schumacher backed the decision, saying that spending more time developing the 2005 car was the right approach, and we will not let anyone make us think differently. He said Ferrari were looking at the battle for the championship as a whole, adding, "We will have a good car for 4 races and a perfect car for 15 races after that." Obviously, that didn't happen. He accepted that starting with the adapted car would move Ferrari a little bit backwards, but he felt the longer wait for the new car would allow it to reach a level that might never have been possible if the 2005 car was brought in too soon. Reminding everyone of how good the 2004 car was, Michael said, "I'm sure many people would be happy to have a compromise like ours at their disposal." But he wasn't expecting Ferrari to have another 2004 season. He reckoned the opposition would have learned from their mistakes, and he was tipping, I really like this, Renault and Mercedes. He kept saying Mercedes instead of McLaren in pre-season quotes as the teams that looked the strongest. Mark, as we covered in our Ferrari 2005 episode back in season 1, we know this didn't work out in the end, but looking at the time, can you understand Ferrari's logic that with how good the 2004 car was, an interim version based on that is probably going to be enough to get you through the first few races of the season?
I can totally understand the logic, and I don't think there was the root of Ferrari's 2005 problem was actually the car as such, and any difference between the F2004M and the F2005. I mean, there was, the later car was obviously a better car, but I don't think that was really at the core of the problem of the 2005 season. It's much more tyre related. So yeah, I can completely get, the car that's won virtually every race the previous year would be an adequate standby, while they obviously got a little bit behind with the development of the 05 car. And so yeah, I can completely get that logic.
While we're talking about Ferrari then, they were at the centre of F1's political battleground, as was so often the case in this era. While the other teams, led by the major manufacturers, were still claiming they were going to set up their own championship for 2008, Ferrari had recently broken ranks and signed a new deal with Bernie Ecclestone to remain a part of F1. This allowed Ferrari to retain the special additional payments it received from F1, which always upset rival teams, I think still does to this day. But Ferrari boss Jean Todt didn't see what all the fuss was about. He said in the run-up to the first race, "Without underestimating what the other teams did, I feel that Ferrari did achieve more than the others. It's like when you produce a movie. You need stars so that you know you are going to sell the movie all over the world. And then you have stars with different contracts. And Ferrari is a star and wants to be paid like a star. I say that without arrogance. I can understand the frustration of the others, but I feel if the others were in our situation, they would do the same thing." He also felt that people had been fine with Ferrari's special status being recognised when it wasn't as competitive, but now Ferrari was so successful, suddenly its commercial terms were a problem for the competition. Matt, Ferrari's special status, as I said, is still a sore point for many in F1 even today. Do you agree with Tot's logic back then that Ferrari was the star that helped sell F1 all over the world?
Reluctantly, yeah, because particularly at the time, the early 2000s flavour of Ferrari was quite hard to like unless you were a Ferrari diehard fan. There was, team orders, sheer dominance. There were two. It was very hard to warm to. So the idea of that version of Ferrari getting special status payments, and I know Todd said, I phrased it, I'm saying this without arrogance. That's a very hard set of things to say and not come across at least a little bit arrogant. Growing up a bit after that and seeing the world change, though, I'm a bit more understanding of Ferrari's status now. It's not just the sheer longevity you really have to admire, with F1 celebrating how many decades it's got through, and Ferrari has been there all the way through. But also, take it right up to the present day, the world would not have got as excited about Lewis Hamilton changing teams if he'd gone anywhere other than Ferrari. Every time a big name driver signs for Ferrari, you see how much pull that mystique still has. So as much as early 2000s me resented everything about Ferrari and begrudged them this payment like I begrudged them some of their success because it was boring me so much at times. He did have a point.
Let's get on to the thing that was going to derail Ferrari's run of success then during this season, as Mark's already hinted at, and that's the new tyre rules. For 2005, tyre changes in races were not allowed, so Bridgestone and Michelin had rushed through development of new, longer life tyres over the winter because this was quite a late change announced in 2004. Michelin boss Pierre Dupasquier said that F1 was embarking on a voyage of discovery with such a different approach to race strategy, although he was worried that the tyre suppliers faced the risk of being blamed by drivers and teams whenever their tyre performance fell away during a race. That sounds familiar. When in fact he felt that the key would be for a driver to adapt his style and the team to adapt their setups to look after the tyres. And his counterpart at Bridgestone, Hirohide Hamashima, wasn't sure the rules were fully explained around when you would be allowed to change a tyre. Hamashima said, "You can change tyres when it is too dangerous to continue, but what is the definition of dangerous? And what if a good driver senses something is wrong with the tyres, stops to change, but after a check there was nothing wrong? What is the judgment on that? I have not had an answer." Mark, can you understand why the tyre companies had some concerns going into this season with these new rules that, as I say, had come about at quite short notice?
Yeah, very much so. You know, the whole reason that the tyre companies are in there is for PR and to enhance the perceived value of their product. And this late notice change, it brought the awful prospect for a tyre company of tyres going bang and causing accidents on live TV. And so I can absolutely understand why they were so uneasy about it, and particularly that little side rule of, well, can you replace a damaged one, or do you have to continue with the damaged one? And we would see that later in the season, of course, play out. And yeah, absolutely, it was a very, very dubious. I'm surprised that the tyre companies agreed to it, because it was very high risk for little reward as far as the tyre companies were concerned.
Elsewhere in F1, there was a bizarre story in pre-season where Williams revealed that BMW was going to supply engines to Sauber in 2006. Frank Williams said that BMW boss Mario Tyson had been very open about it and told him that supplying engines to a second team would make BMW stronger. We know that BMW would end up leaving Williams and actually buying Sauber for 2006, but at this stage, Williams were relaxed, with Frank saying he had no problem with Sauber becoming a BMW customer and that Williams' deal as the works team would carry on. This all got very confusing very quickly though. Sauber denied a deal was done, saying it was evaluating all potential options, and Peter Sauber actually named Ferrari, BMW and Toyota as those options. Tyson said there was nothing decided and that BMW was talking to several teams. And then Ferrari, which had supplied Sauber since 1997, was willing to see Sauber move on if it could find a better deal. Jean Todt even admitted that the initial deal in 97 was done against our will, and that Ferrari only agreed to it back then because otherwise Sauber would have gone out of business. Mark, you were in F1 at the time. You saw that the tension building between BMW and Williams. We're close to breaking point now. What do you think was going on at this point, though? Was Frank making mischief putting this Sauber story out there?
I don't think he was so much making mischief as trying to sort of expose what was going on, bring into the light what was going on, because he, at this stage, I don't think knew for certain what BMW's plans were, and he needed to know very quickly for 2006. So I think the decision had been made already internally at BMW, but hadn't been officially conveyed to anyone. And that, Frank this was his way, I think, of exposing the story to the light and then seeing, if that got him any further forward. I think that's all it was about.
Yeah, lob a grenade and see if it helps at all. Kimi Räikkönen had also been in the news over the winter, often for all the wrong reasons, or at least wrong reasons in some people's eyes, usually alcohol-fueled. And straight-laced McLaren boss Ron Dennis addressed this in the build-up to the season in an Autosport interview with Nigel Roebuck. Ron admitted that Raikkonen's antics were not the way we would like him to behave, and he said he had spoken to Kimi about it. He said that he would categorically refuse to tell any driver how to live their lives, because that never works, and all he could do was lay everything out very clearly and give people an understanding of what is the right way to go. Ron also claimed that 90% of what was reported clearly did not happen, although friend of the show and former McLaren mechanic Mark Priestley wrote in his book, titled The Mechanic, that the majority of reporting around what Raikkonen got up to when under the influence was fairly accurately reported. Mark also said that while everyone else at McLaren worked under Ron's intense scrutiny, Raikkonen did what he wanted, and the people around Ron would have to repair any damage or come up with creative statements to divert attention away from whatever it was Kimi had done or said that week. Matt, I get the whole thing of you've got to let a star driver kind of live their own life, but are you surprised that Raikkonen got away with as much as he did at McLaren? Or was that just a sign of the fact that even Ron Dennis, even someone like Ron, understood kind of key to this guy's brilliance is letting him be a lunatic when he's away from the track?
No, I'm actually still surprised that he was able to be that version of Kimi under that version of Ron, because traditionally through history, drivers get more boring under McLaren. Like David Coulthard's personality became much more obvious to the world once he was outside McLaren. I can remember Ron kind of grumbling about Fernando Alonso's scruffy hair early on in 2007, which I think was already a sign of Fernando trying to wind Ron up as well. But yeah, this was so un-McLaren. It wasn't like, you can imagine Mika Hakkinen getting away with stuff with Ron because Ron had that incredible fondness for him, that special relationship after the Adelaide 95 crash. Was he just seeing Kimi as like similar enough to Mika that therefore I should leave him be a little bit as well? To be honest, for me, the bigger clue is in more of Mark Priestley's book, where actually when he explains how they covered certain things up and the role Kimi's trainer played in just squashing some of these stories, even getting like broken bones secretly treated sometimes. I genuinely think it's possible Ron just didn't know the full story a lot of the time, or it was sufficiently concealed. I mean, this was pre-social media age as well, so the coverage of Kimi doing this would have basically been in tabloid newspapers. As a fan and working kind of on the periphery of motorsport media at the time, I didn't know most of this stuff. The Kimi Larry reputation, I only kind of found out a few years later, really, just like reading broadsheets and Autosport and being really boring. You didn't know this stuff was going on. So I genuinely think Ron probably believed that a lot of it was made up or just wasn't seeing the stories about it. And that has to be the only reason he got that much leeway, because it's otherwise so un-McLaren.
Yeah, good theory. Nobody was reporting on any drunken antics for another emerging F1 star at this time, Fernando Alonso, but he was annoyed with different stories he'd seen about himself in the press, as there was a narrative that suggested he was lazy. Alonso was reported to have been annoyed by some comments made by Jenson Button, although I must say that during my research, I couldn't find those original quotes. I found Alonso reacting to them in plenty of places, but couldn't find the originals. But Alonso felt this all dated back to 2003, when his own team, Renault, had said he wasn't working hard enough. Alonso said this was not a very good comment from the team. From that point, everyone thinks I don't work hard. I work much harder than any of the teammates I had. People can say many things about me, but not that I was not working hard. I don't care what was said, but this was not the truth, and unfortunately, people believed it. Mark, do you recall during those early years ever hearing that Fernando didn't work hard?
I can't say I can recall that. I can recall some comments by Pat Simmons when he was being asked to compare Fernando's impact within the team to that of Michael Schumacher in the Benetton years, and him saying something like he's not as tightly woven into the team as Michael was. He doesn't know everyone's name and their birthdays and all that. But I don't think that was meant as a criticism. Whether that was picked up as a criticism and interpreted that he wasn't as hardworking, maybe. But I can't actually remember I don't remember the button quotes. Whether he made them or not, I don't know. But no, laziness is not something that I ever recall being associated with Alonso. He's sometimes had a difficult relationship, even at Enstone, whereby he felt if he wasn't being supported enough as the number one, he could get a little bit emotional. But I don't think that was ever. I don't think he ever sort of decided not to put any effort in response. I think he would just have an outburst. So no, it's a bit of a strange one, that.
If you were going to describe like the worst is a relative term, parts of Alonso at this point in his career, you'd kind of say maybe self-serving loose cannon at times, but he put quite a lot of effort into being that as well, so it wasn't even lazy about how he did that.
There was new management in place at BAR, which was coming into 2005 off the back of its best ever season in F1, where it finished second in the constructors' standings to Ferrari. But BAR still hadn't won a race. A new CEO, Nick Fryer, who'd been placed in charge after previous boss David Richards had successfully got Honda to buy a significant stake of the team, felt that getting that first win in 2005 was more important than where the team finished in the championship. Fry said BAR would be willing to compromise our championship position for the trade-off of getting a race win, and he said that while BAR's rise up the standings in recent years was a great improvement, he felt we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much, as BAR still hadn't won and was a country mile behind Ferrari in 2004, like everyone else. Matt, I'm not sure how you compromise your championship position to win a race, but did Fry have a point that getting a first win was now becoming more important than BAR just having another solid, consistent kind of front-running season?
Yeah, I do absolutely get that stance in the context of 2004, when the story for the whole season was, when is Jenson Button going to beat Michael Schumacher to a race win? Because it was Button and BAR who, for so much of the season, were the ones who were always there, always posing the consistent, genuine threat. And then end of the season, Renault's won a race, McLaren's won a race, Williams has won a race, BAR hasn't. And profile-wise, and for a team with sponsors and with the Honda relationship, I absolutely get the fact that the headlines had ultimately gone to other teams. I agree, Glenn. I don't know how they blow a championship position to get those wins. I don't think that it wasn't like Renault, Williams, and McLaren were saving up their good engines or their setups for like one track each to win. So his theory's a bit off there. But yeah, BAR being second in the championship again with no wins would not have been an impressive result, as they'd done that already. They needed to have the breakthrough that in the end they didn't get this season.
David Richards wasn't the only F1 team boss to leave over the winter, as 2005 also started without Eddie Jordan in charge of the team that would carry his name for one more year. We talked earlier in this season of Bring Back V10s in our Brazil 2004 episode about how EJ knew the writing was on the wall for his team, and over the winter he had managed to get out, selling to Canadian billionaire Alex Schneider of the Midland Group. Eddie opened his autobiography by talking about what he was doing on the weekend of the first F1 race since 1990, where he wasn't in charge of a team that was taking part. He said he tried to get as far away from motorsport as he could, so he headed to Dubai to spend time on a yacht, and he said he was surprised to find that it didn't matter at all that he wasn't in Australia for the first race. He said it seemed bizarre that his motorsport life could be over, as it had consumed him for 30 years. But now it was time to see what else was out there for him. He had also turned down an offer to run the Irish team in the new A1GP series, mainly because the championship wanted him to pay to hold the franchise, whereas he felt A1GP should pay him for the prestige of having the Jordan name involved. So Eddie may not have been in charge of a team anymore, but his sharpness for a deal hadn't gone missing just yet. But Mark, you were there in Australia, you're in the paddock. Was Eddie's absence noticeable from that weekend in 2005? Did F1 miss him?
I think it was noted rather than notable, because that's the funny thing about F1. It just keeps going. It's so intense. You get forgotten about so quickly if you're not there. You're on the bus or you're off the bus, and the bus goes without you. And yeah, I mean, even Bernie Ecclestone, you would have thought, once he left the sport, it would feel completely different. It felt a little bit different, I guess, but not in any meaningful way. It was just, it was the next race, and everything's dictated by the timetable, the next race, the lap time, and everything comes from that. And so, yeah, it was noted that he wasn't there, but it really didn't. I didn't get the sense that it was in anybody's mind. Once the weekend starts and the competition starts, the past is the past, and it really does move on very quick.
I guess it's also Jordan had slid to the back of the grid and become less relevant anyway, hadn't they? We're not talking about Eddie suddenly stepping back from the team during like peak buzzing Hornets era, where maybe it'd have been more noticeable. But Eddie also wrote in his book that he didn't want to start turning up to races as an ex-team boss with no purpose or no job. He'd already had approaches about TV work, which, as we all know, he'd eventually carve out an incredible career in, but he didn't want to do that immediately. He said in his book he wanted a definite break to look at other things, but in March 2005, he had told Autosport that he'd be open to working with Bernie Ecclestone to help promote F1 itself. EJ felt F1 could be more exciting and add razzmatazz to the weekends, so people came away from them feeling they'd had an incredible time. He said he was willing to be of help to Bernie if he could, and he had ideas around sensible promotional things that can make the race into a much bigger spectacle for the people who are there, as well as doing a better job of exploiting TV opportunities. Matt, do you think Eddie Jordan would have been good at a role like this if he'd gone in to work with Bernie Ecclestone on promoting F1?
Depends how much he would have been allowed to do, but I think he would have had the right ideas, because even that kind of brief summary there, Liberty Media is not a company that will use the word razzmatazz in this part of the 21st century, but yeah, so much of what it's done since it took over F1 has been about making the events into proper events, not just there's a race and there's not a lot else going on, like fully exploiting the celebrities that turn up. So many of the things Eddie expanded on in his book were exactly what Liberty's gone on and done a decade plus later. And yeah, Eddie had the showmanship and sales ability to pitch those ideas, and I think he would have probably been spot on with probably 95% of them if he'd had the freedom to push promoters along in the right direction. If Bernie had kind of let him get on with it and bought into it.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Eddie was, as we often say, and we said this when we paid tribute to him last year, or whenever it was, earlier this year, as we're recording this, he was always much sharper than he sort of gave the
Definitely.
image that he projected. And I do think if he'd gone into work as a kind of double act with Bernie, Eddie would have been the one who actually had his fingers on the pulse of what the world wanted, what the public wanted, what would make a good spectacle by this point. But it took Liberty prizing Bernie Ecclestone's grasp off of Formula One for all these things to open up quite a few years later, more than a decade after this. So maybe Eddie would have come up against some brick walls. But Eddie was out of F1 then. However, his fellow struggler Paul Stoddart at Minardi was still well and truly in the thick of it. Stoddart was trying to get approval this weekend for Minardi to race with its cars in 2004 spec, only updated to 2005 safety standards, as he claimed the team couldn't have their definitive 2005 package ready until round 4 because the rule changes had been agreed so late in 2004. The FIA's position on this heading into the weekend was that Minardi would need agreement from the other 9 teams to allow cars not complying with the technical regulations to take the start. Bizarrely, this was initially pitched as a battle of the Italian teams, as Stoddart was claiming that Ferrari was the only team refusing to agree to the Minardi's running in 2004 spec. That wasn't quite true, as Jordan and Red Bull later said they wouldn't have signed the agreement either. But Stoddart was telling anyone who would listen in the paddock that Minardi will not be competing in Sunday's race because Jean Todt has refused to agree to our request. When Todt arrived in Melbourne, which I think was only on the Friday, he said the situation was not Ferrari against Minardi. He said Ferrari often helped Minardi when it could, and that he respected Minardi and all of the small teams that had to fight to stay afloat. However, his view was, you have a game, and if you want to play in it, the rules should be the same for everybody. The reason this was such a big deal really was because the cars had been slowed down for 2005, so by running to 2004 rules, Minardi's cars would have an advantage. Michael Schumacher backed his team boss, Todt, saying that letting Minardi race with its 2004 cars would be like letting a football team that's not doing very well have an extra player. Todt reiterated that he felt it was the FIA's decision on what to do about Minardi. He said he would sign any paperwork if it was presented to him with all the other teams already in agreement, which, as we just explained, never actually happened. But Mark, are you surprised that Ferrari was so bothered about Minardi potentially running with cars that were out of spec?
Not really. I think Jean was always one for the detail and, looking after his interests very, very aggressively. And I think the team's interests. And I think at this stage, it wasn't definitively known just, how competitive would a 2004 spec Minardi be, against a field of cars that had been slowed by the regulation. And if it, interfered with the championship in terms of it might have got points that it otherwise wouldn't have done and denied other teams, those points, then yeah, I could see that there was a case to be defended, really. And I think that if you could have known in advance, just right, what are we talking about here? How quick is the car potentially going to be relative to the rest of us? Then they could have made a more informed decision, but it hadn't been out. Nobody knew. So, I think it ended up a bigger deal than it needed to have been in hindsight.
I did also wonder if Ferrari or Todt was maybe worried about setting a precedent where it's kind of, okay, Minardi are going to be at the back, probably even with the 2004 car. But if you agree to that, does someone a bit more competitive try it on the next time there's a rule change? That's that was my guess anyway. But anyway, the Minardis passed scrutineering on the Thursday before the race in 2004 spec, but that was really just from a kind of safety checks point of view. The cars didn't run during Friday practice, with Stoddart complaining that he was being messed about and that Minardi was a victim of political games. FIA President Max Mosley called Stoddart naive and pointed out that he had known about the rule changes since September 2004, like everyone else, and he had voted in favour of them. Stoddart said that the hold-up for him had been the uncertainty created around Cosworth when Ford announced it was quitting F1. So Minardi hadn't been able to press on with its 2005 cars while it was unsure which engine it would have. The race stewards then rejected Minardi's appeal to run in 2004 spec, saying it was inappropriate and unacceptable to change the rules for one team. So Minardi was ordered to upgrade its cars to the 2005 rules if it wanted to take part in the weekend. Stoddart said he felt he got a fair hearing from the stewards, and he reckoned that they took that decision with a heavy heart. He said Minardi would try to modify the cars overnight for Saturday, as it had its 2005 bodywork in Australia. It just didn't want to use it as none of the parts had run yet, so he was worried it wouldn't be safe, and they didn't have any spares. But alongside that, he was also preparing to take legal action, believing Minardi had a watertight case that it wanted a judge to rule on. Matt, we're going to come back to that legal case in a minute. What do you think of the steward's decision to say, no, you can't turn up and run your 2004 cars?
What else could they do in that circumstance? It's literally the rules. The rules have changed for this season. They are the rules that all the teams are adhering to. The Minardi case is so subjective in terms of how many other teams had question marks? Well, probably not that many, but Jordan, certainly. And I think Jordan's opposition to what Minardi was asking was quite vocal as well. It was such a subjective case. Stewards are there to judge the rules in black and white. And in this case, F1 has a lot of grey areas in its rules, but your car should match the rules of the season, not a different season. It's a fairly fundamental one that was always going to come down this way.
As for that legal action then, remarkably, you might say, it was a success. Late on Friday, Stoddart got an injunction from the Supreme Court that overruled the stewards and said he would be allowed to run his cars to 2004 spec for the rest of the weekend. Stoddart called this a landmark decision that proved F1 needed better governance than it was getting from the FIA. The FIA reacted angrily to this ruling, releasing a statement on Saturday morning saying that the stewards and the FIA were not notified of the court proceedings taking place and weren't given a chance to attend. It also said if Australian courts could overrule the decisions of appointed officials and the governing body, then the World Motorsport Council would have to think very carefully to decide if a World Championship motorsport event of any kind can ever be held again in Australia. Matt, what do you think of this reaction? Was that a fair position for the FIA to take?
No, it's pathetic. It's just... As much as I'm not, there's no player in this storyline who I've got really much sympathy for. But that statement is fine up to a point. I see the FIA's stance that it's their event, it's their rules. What is an external court doing, making this particular ruling? Then it gets into that phrasing: can a World Championship motorsport event of any kind ever, say Rally Australia is getting itself back together again for like a 2035 bid, and we have to go, no, because that Australian court did that ruling in favour of Minardi 30 years ago, and we said no, never ever again in Australia for any World Championship motorsport. So, yeah, sorry for all of time. We've now just blacklisted Australia. That's just absolute petulant nonsense from a global organisation. Really stupid.
You got to be careful, though, because what you don't want when Rally Australia comes back in 2035 is somebody to find some 2004 Minardis and get a Supreme Court judge to say, that's absolutely fine. Take those out on the rally.
But if someone could turn up with some 1990s rally cars and be allowed to run those, that would probably be a much better rally than whatever is on WRC stages now, wouldn't it? So, yeah, go Australia.
Yeah, we may be preaching to the converted here, but I feel like more people would watch that rally. Right, after all that fuss, the Minardis then emerged on track on Saturday morning, running to the 2005 regulations. Stoddart said his team had worked through the night to update the cars in the interests of the Australian Grand Prix, so he had decided to discontinue the action. He said he felt he had taken the matter as far as he needed to, and that in his mind it was over. He called the FIA's angry statement an ill-judged, ill-timed document, which I believe was created to disrupt and discredit the Minardi team, the Australian Grand Prix, and me. That's Paul Stoddart, not me. I don't think I was particularly relevant. He said F1 was being pushed to destruction because the FIA was being run so poorly, and he felt there was too much pig-headed arrogance in all quarters that would lead to the demise of F1. Stoddart called for Max Mosley to step down, calling his threats against Australian motorsport pathetic. He even said that the FIA's lawyers told him on Friday night that Mosley was threatening to cancel the race if Stoddart didn't back down. Mosley felt that Stoddart was being used politically by rival teams who will turn on him as soon as it suits them, while Bernie Ecclestone went much further, telling The Sun that there is now no place in Formula One for someone like Paul, adding, if you can't sustain a team, then you should get out. And he said, just like Eddie Jordan had done. Stoddart made brief reference to this weekend on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast, saying he was always prepared to play the politics to a level because you need to stand up for yourself, particularly as a back-of-the-grid team. But he said he would never let politics ruin the racing, and he would always back down once it looked like that was going to be the case. Mark, we could have done a whole episode on this nonsense. In my research, I had nearly 3,000 words about this saga from just a few days of everybody mouthing off about it. Ultimately, did this just boil down to little more than political bickering, and was it actually a waste of everybody's time?
It was a complete waste of everyone's time, but behind it was the fight was still ongoing for power between the teams, the manufacturer teams, the FIA, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction on both sides, and it bled through into something as insignificant as this. But yeah, it was real storm in a teacup.
It just became such a big story for something so inconsequential. Where I was talking about with a few of our colleagues at the race last night who remember 2005 much better than me, but had completely forgotten this saga happened. Because actually when it came to it, the car still raced. And even, okay, the cars have been slowed down for 2005, but looking at like a super times measure, 2004, the best Australia lap times over the weekend were 1 minute 24s. 2005, there were 1 minute 25s. It wasn't like 5 or 6 seconds lopped off the lap times. Minardi was at the back. It would have been at or near the back with its 2004 cars because its 2004 car wasn't very good anyway. This wasn't going to be something that suddenly put a Minardi on pole. It's just one of those sagas that perhaps in the F1 media as well, we're really guilty of just like stoking them up because it's brilliant headlines for a few days for something that actually, whatever the outcome, unless the outcome is mostly cancelling the entire Australian Grand Prix and banning Australia from having motorsport in it, whatever, if any outcome south of that, no one watching the race, bar a few really hardcore people, would notice if the Minardis were even there or not. So 3,000 words of research, Glenn, for something that in the end is a good story, but mattered so little.
I love it when that happens. This was also, obviously, you know, we're still in the dawn of proper online media reporting, and, you know, autosport.com, which I know even at this point, Matt, you were involved in, was getting its teeth into more kind of live news reporting. So I guess that gave all the people involved an almost daily platform to say loads of stuff and get it all reported, not just in newspapers, but all over the internet as well. Whereas just a few years earlier, okay, Stoddart and Mosley could have argued each day, but when you read it in a magazine the next week, you just kind of get a summary. It would be, oh, the Minardis tried to race their 2004 cars. They went to court for a bit, but it didn't happen. Max Mosley got quite angry. 200 words, and you've summed it up. But we've devoted much more time than that to it here. Talking of things that are a waste of time, Australia 2005 marked the debut, as we mentioned at the start, for the new aggregate qualifying format, where 2 one-shot sessions would take place and the lap times would be added together. We have talked about this format in previous 2005 episodes, so we'll spare you a repeat of that here. But as Mark said at the beginning, the season opener exposed one of the worst problems with this format, as changeable weather during first qualifying meant the gaps were so big between most of the cars that Sunday morning's grid deciding session was largely pointless. It wasn't pointless for Renault's Giancarlo Fisichella though, as he'd had the best of the conditions on Saturday, so he started his first race back with the Renault team that he'd previously raced for when it was Benetton from pole position. Behind him on the grid we had Jarno Trulli's Toyota, Mark Webber's Williams, Jacques Villeneuve's Sauber, and then the new Red Bulls of David Coulthard and Christian Klein. Meanwhile, the McLarens of Juan Pablo Montoya and Kimi Raikkonen were 9th and 10th. Rubens Barrichello's Ferrari was 11th. Fisichella's teammate Fernando Alonso was 13th, and reigning champion Michael Schumacher was 19th, having decided to take a fresh engine for the race after catching the worst of the rainstorm that hit during first qualifying. And to show how the weather had really messed up the aggregate system, Fisichella was on pole by 3 seconds, nearly 6 seconds covered the top 5, and 14 seconds covered the top 10. It's like they're racing on the Nordschleife. Matt, we don't have to discuss the format here, but is the one positive from this that at least we had an exciting mixed up grid?
No, because the format had nothing to do with it. You know, if there hadn't been aggregate qualifying, the key session with the interesting weather happened on Saturday afternoon when qualifying happens. So you would have still got a mixed up grid, either had it been one shot with people running in different weather, or even old school 60-minute go for it with rain turning up when it did. Whatever happened, you dump some rain on qualifying, it gets more interesting. You don't then have to do qualifying all over again next day to make it fun because you mixed the grid up already. So it's just more evidence it's a rubbish idea.
The mixed-up grid meant Fisichella had quite a simple mission ahead of him in what was considered to be one of the best cars from pre-season testing, and once Trulli's light-fueled Toyota came in 5 laps before the race leader, Fisi had a pretty straightforward race as the other expected frontrunners tried to make their way through the pack. However, he did require what would become a customary kick up the backside from his engineer Alan Permain in the middle of the race. It's not as funny as the one he got at the same race a year later, where Permain said it could not be possible for him to be 2 seconds slower than teammate Alonso. But let's hear what was said in 2005 when Fisi was cruising out front.
Giancarlo, you have Coulthard 10 seconds behind you, but he's quicker than you at the moment, mate. He's quicker, so you need to keep the pace up,
Permain mentioned these regular exchanges on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast, saying Fisichella would lose a bit of focus in the race now and then. I would have to say concentrate, just stop daydreaming and get on with the job. Get your head down, get on with it. Fisichella addressed this radio message after the race, saying it was no problem to push more as the car was up to it and he was finding the race quite easy, so he'd been conservative and hadn't been pushing. Mark, as amusing as these messages were whenever they got played out on the TV, was this actually an insight into one of the things that held Fisichella back from perhaps achieving greater things in F1?
Yeah, I think so. He was a talented guy, but he didn't have that focus. And when you put him alongside someone like Alonso, it's very clear that difference in approach. And yeah, you would, if there'd been stories, you going back to your earlier thing about, was Alonso lazy? If it had been about Fisichella, you could have understood it because, that he didn't, he just didn't. He turned up. He was a quick driver, and that was it. He sort of flatlined at a level, and if you give him a huge big advantage, like he'd just been gifted by the circumstances of qualifying, he was comfortably good enough to win a Grand Prix, but he wasn't going to win a whole sequence of them on equal terms to everyone else. He wasn't going to be someone that was focused enough and consistent enough to always exploit the maximum from himself and his car. He was just someone who was very, very good. And in certain like changeable conditions, he was very, very quick. He had a lovely feel for the car, he had a real talent to drive. But that was about where it ended, really. He was a happy guy, like happy-go-lucky guy. He had a nice life and he was enjoying it. But you never got the impression it went much deeper than that. So yeah, I can quite understand. And probably, the concern on the pit wall is, you're cruising because the cars immediately behind you aren't a threat, but there's some very quick cars behind them that may be a threat later on. And we saw that play out in the 2005 Japanese Grand Prix, of course, later in the season.
Yeah, very, very, very true. What you're describing there does make me wonder if maybe Fisi was born into slightly the wrong era. What you've described there is the kind of guy who perhaps in the 70s or 80s in the right car would have won a few more races and would have been a bit of a cult hero. Everyone had gone, he's so cool, and he just gets in the car and drives and wins a few races. Whereas at this point, we're talking about even Fernando Alonso's professionalism kind of being scrutinised. By then, you couldn't really be just a kind of laid-back guy who just turned up and, as you said, was quick on his day. But in the end, Fisi got the job done, claiming his second F1 win. And this time he got to stand on the top step of the podium to collect the trophy, rather than having to wait a week like he did when his Brazil 2003 win for Jordan was wrongly given to Kimi Räikkönen at first. Fisichella said it felt completely different this time, and that winning in a front-running car was a lot easier than I expected. He said at the time it was the best moment of his career, and he was excited to drive a car with so much potential. Fisi didn't win again in 2005, but in this moment, having just won the season opener in a car that was clearly quick, did you think Fisichella might be able to build on this and deliver on what he called fantastic potential?
Yeah, I did. I suspected, but actually more than suspect, I was a big Alonso fan at this point, and I was fairly confident how this Renault battle was going to go. But Fisi was still at this point a bit of an unanswered question. That he'd had some amazing seasons up to that point. I thought 97, his rookie season, was great. I thought 2001 and the terrible, still Benetton then, wasn't it? Not quite Renault, was really impressive. So it's one of these turning points where you find out if a driver who's clearly talented can translate that into consistent top-level performance in the best car, as well as occasional underdog heroics in the rubbish one. And we found out really quickly what the case was with Fisichella. But at this point, after this first race, you looked at what had just happened and thought, the Renault's genuinely good. It's got two really good drivers. The McLaren's been really good in testing. It's got two really good drivers, because at this point, Raikkonen hasn't ended Montoya's career. And I can still think back to this time, even though my memories of 2005 are sketchy, and think, I'm pretty sure Ferrari will still win this championship, because that is just what happens in this era. But it's got some really strong opposition, and it's got two drivers at Renault who could be in the mix. But obviously that feeling didn't last very long. Yeah,
I'm with you. I think I've assumed Alonso would be the better of the two, but I certainly thought it might be a sort of season where if Renault ended up with the best car, you might see Alonso win 6 or 7 races and Fisichella win 3 or 4 or something like that. Yeah. I wouldn't have said he only won one more race for Renault after this. But behind the winner, and as Mark hinted at, we did have charging cars trying to catch up, because Rubens Barrichello and a flying Fernando Alonso jumped David Coulthard's Red Bull at the second pit stops to deny Red Bull a debut podium. Barrichello said his result showed Ferrari were not in crisis, but we'll come back to them because the star of this race, in my eyes anyway, was Alonso. He spent the first 16 laps spent behind the struggling Sauber of Jacques Villeneuve, who had dropped from 4th to 9th on the opening lap. Alonso briefly got past him once, but Villeneuve got him straight back with incredible racecraft. And when Alonso finally made the move stick, he was 31 seconds behind leader Fisichella and 12 behind Barrichello, and they ran 8th and 9th at this point. From there, Alonso had great pace, though. He ran long before his final pit stop to climb up the order and then chased Barrichello to the flag as they finished just 5 and 6 seconds behind Fisichella by the end. So Fisi definitely did need to pick up the pace in the middle. Alonso said his battle with Villeneuve was a very good fight. That's quite diplomatic, even if it cost him so much time. And he said to recover a podium finish from being half a minute off the lead felt like a victory. Mark, although it was Fisichella was the Renault driver that won the race, was Alonso's race more impressive?
Oh, completely, yeah. I mean, were it not for that delay, it would have been through the field and onto Fisichella's tail and passed him in no time at all. He was, he was in a, if Jacques had sort of decided that my race is not with this guy, he's in a much quicker car, then that would have been the likely outcome. The times that he was doing at the end were very, very impressive indeed, and made you realise that actually this Renault is it could be something quite special.
Now, as we mentioned, Red Bull just missed out on a podium in its first race after taking over Jaguar. David Coulthard spent in total 37 of the 57 laps running in the top 3 places before getting shuffled back. Coulthard accepted that Red Bull had benefited from both cars running at the right time in first qualifying, and he had felt that a podium finish was achievable. He said, at one stage, I was beginning to dream a little, but I can't complain about 4th place. It's much more than we expected. The new team boss, Christian Horner, aged just 31 at this point, called it a fantastic debut race for Red Bull. And he said the result was on merit, as it wasn't a race of high attrition, and Coulthard and Clean had simply held their places up front throughout the race. He said the result meant Red Bull had already exceeded its first target for 2005, which was credibility. So now the goal was to get a podium finish. Matt, we cover this in a lot of detail in our Red Bull 2005 episode, but how important was it to get a result like this to help Red Bull make that good first impression in F1?
Yeah, really, really important, because right from the outset, there was a kind of what's a drinks company doing, thinking it can see itself as an actual F1 team chat. The Horner decision, bringing him in, was a surprise. People knew Jaguar was a mess, but I feel like among the media, there was a bit of residual loyalty to the bosses who were trying to make it work, and then being turfed out and Horner being brought in was an eyebrow raiser. So the whole organisation did kind of need to establish itself as something credible, and this was great. And it carried on being repeatedly really credible through its first season, and kind of set it did enough at this point to set the tone for everything that followed. It had its ups and downs before it became a race-winning force, but this race and a few others in 2005 showed it was well worth taking seriously, and made the people who ultimately signed for it and turned it into the team it was know that it was worth looking at really seriously.
We mentioned there that this wasn't a high race of attrition. There are only 3 proper retirements, 2 of which we'll talk about in a moment. However, technically there were 2 more DNFs, as right at the end, both BARs pulled into the pits to retire. It seemed pretty obvious that this was a ploy to allow both cars to take fresh engines for the next race in Malaysia, because 2005 we now had to have race engines had to last 2 weekends. But when this was put to Jenson Button live on TV immediately post-race, he's still walking back to the hospitality, he denied it, saying he was told he had a problem and to stop. And it's worth seeking this interview out, because he really glares at ITV's Louise Goodman when she amusingly says to him, "Are you being serious?" Like, it's so clear what they've done. And credit to Louise for kind of going, "Come on, Jenson, are you serious here?" And his face, he gives her an absolute death stare for that. Then literally 3 minutes later on the ITV live post-show, Team boss Nick Fry was asked about it and immediately admitted it was a strategic decision to have fresh engines for the heat of Malaysia. Fry said BAR only did it because Button and Takuma Sato were both running out of the points, so he said we might as well take advantage of the rules as we see them. Button was a bit more open about it later on, saying he was surprised other teams didn't do it as well. Mark, clearly a bit of communication breakdown there between Button and the team on what to say in public, in fairness, when he just got out of the car. But what did you think of that decision to stop a lap early to exploit this loophole in the rules to get fresh engines for Malaysia?
Yeah, it's just one of those funny little loopholes that comes up when you change the regulations. And it became a thing, didn't it? If a team was running out of the points and no prospect of getting in them late in the race, and the engines were getting a bit tired and you needed another one. It wasn't just a one-off. It became a thing, but I don't think anybody was too bothered about it. In the end, it wasn't affecting the points positions.
Yeah, and it kind of evolved, didn't it? When we got into the era of you can have rather than engines must last a set number of weekends, you have engines for a set number of engines for the season, and then you'd often have. It would usually be if a front-running driver's running lower down the order than they want to be. They'd sort of, if they've had enough, they do the thing of, should we retire to save the engine? When what they really mean is, can we retire because I've had enough? Most people weren't that bothered about what BAR did, but Honda's Japanese rival Toyota wasn't impressed with its engine boss Luca Marmarini saying, exploitation of such grey areas is against our understanding of racing. He said Toyota didn't do the same as BAR out of respect for the new rules, saying that Toyota accepts the spirit and intention of the regulations. Maybe that's why you never won. Ferrari's Ross Brawn took a more pragmatic view, as you might expect. He said each team had a choice to make, although he added, if we believe the new format is the way forward, we need to smooth out all the small glitches there may be. And that's what happened as the FIA closed the loophole. It released a statement between the first two rounds saying, as a result of what happened on the last lap of the race in Melbourne, a distinction will now be made between failing to finish and choosing not to finish. And to avoid this rule being further taken advantage of, it said if any reason for retirement was not completely clear, teams would be required to explain retirements on the first weekend of an engine cycle to the stewards. Matt, was that a good move to tighten up this the kind of crinkle in the regulations that had immediately been exploited?
Yeah, like you say, it's still kind of part of the F1 world, the concept of now that components are stretched much further, let's save the mileage if we're going nowhere. They had to take a firm stance to stop it getting a bit silly, because I do think it had the potential to suddenly see a lot of cars start doing this, and we're really early in this concept of parts lasting more than one race as well. So if it was ever going to go crazy and just get to a ridiculous extent on the eve of a hot race, it would be in 2005 when a lot of teams were running out the points and go, oh, they got away with it last week, so we may as well. And then you do get a little bit of an embarrassing fast, but there's so many things that are so different about the rules with the engine life, with the tyre life being such a thing. Watching the race back on the ITV commentary, Martin Brundle makes a comment that it feels a bit like the 1980s and trying to save fuel with the turbo cars. And it was just a little bit of a cultural shift at this point that was for all the right reasons, because there's not an endless supply of money and oil in the world, so you may as well try to not be as kind of profligate as F1 used to be. But it made for a different tone of F1 that it hasn't really got away with in terms of kind of lift and coast became a thing that little while later. Components have been stretched since then. It was definitely a kind of change of vibe. I'm glad it was for the right reasons. I'm glad it didn't get to a silly extent, but there was, watching it back, I was like, oh yeah, at the time I did find this a little bit unsettling that this was now such a big part of F1 culture.
Yeah, that Brundle point's a really good one. He was kind of really put out, wasn't he? That I think it kind of Raikkonen and Schumacher were. He felt sort of trundling around and weren't really pulling their finger out trying to drive through the field. And it's also an example of how TV can play such a big role in shaping the public's perception of this sort of stuff. And I actually think modern day F1 itself has become quite wise to this and probably pushes the TV companies to talk stuff up, sprints, which maybe wasn't the case back in this era. Now, someone we've barely mentioned in this episode is reigning champion Michael Schumacher, who had a forgettable first weekend, as I said, of what would turn out to be a miserable 2005 season. After getting caught out by the weather in qualifying and taking an engine penalty, he spent the first 18 laps of the race running 15th, but when we got to 16 laps to go, he's running 7th and in the mix for a lower points finish. He then rejoined from his final pit stop in front of the Williams of Nick Heidfeld, who attacked on the approach to turn 3. Schumacher moved across to cover the move off. Heidfeld ended up on the grass on the inside of the corner and then clattered into the side of the Ferrari. Schumacher persuaded the marshals to push him out of the gravel, but when he rejoined, his car was too badly damaged to continue. Heidfeld said Schumacher pushed him onto the grass and left him no space when he was making what he thought was quite a good move. Ross Brawn said that Heidfeld was in the wrong and came from quite a reasonable distance back, although Ross then called it a racing accident that was not Michael's fault. Schumacher also called it a racing incident, saying it was impossible to blame either one of us. He said, I quite like these quotes. He said, he had made it clear I was defending my position, adding later, I indicate that I don't want him to try and pass me on the inside. so Michael Schumacher, isn't it? I have indicated you are not allowed to overtake me. He then continued, he doesn't accept that. He still tries, and off he goes. You can't really blame him for trying, nor blame me for trying not to let him go down the inside. It's one of those things. Mark, I'll come to you first on this. As I say, I love the wording there, but how would you assess the crash? Was there one driver more at fault than the other?
I thought Nick overreacted a little bit when Michael sort of moved right to indicate that he didn't want him to pass. I thought that I thought Nick was sort of he moved probably about 3 feet further to the right than he needed to, and he didn't need to be on the grass. He went on the grass in the expectation that Michael was going to move further across than he actually did. So he would have been better just sitting where he was in hindsight. Yeah, it was a racing incident, but if I had to say who was more at fault, I would say it was Nick.
Yeah, Schumacher's done worse chops than that, hasn't he? It looks like Heidfeld's just a little bit inexperienced in going wheel to wheel with Schumacher, because he wouldn't have had much chance to in his F1 career up to that point. And then this happens, and like Mark says, he overreacts in the expectation that Schumacher's going to probably take him all the way to the wall or something, but it doesn't happen. I also thought with how far back Heidfeld was coming from, the chances of that move being particularly successful were not great, regardless of where Schumacher did or whether Heidfeld drove onto the grass or not. It was, as someone who was really keen to see Schumacher and Ferrari dethroned, regardless of whose fault it was, I loved seeing that Ferrari end up in the gravel at that point, because it was just straight away a 0 score for the person I thought was going to make the season boring.
Yeah, that's fair enough. There's good footage on the season review where they sort of added in some of the radio, and you get the radio to Schumacher going, get them to push you out the gravel. I always felt that Ferrari and Schumacher were really good at playing the whole, we're in a dangerous position, therefore we're allowed to be pushed back into the race. But actually, in this case, he rejoined. They went, this car's too broken. Game over. And that's also game over for our Australia 2005 episode. And Giancarlo Fisichella's big title push is up and running. Let's see how that goes. Thanks to Mark and Matt for joining us for this one. Thank you to everyone on Patreon who voted for this episode, giving us the slightly odd but quite fun quirk of having the final race of 2004 and the first race of 2005 appearing in the same season. Normally I wouldn't allow that sort of thing, but we do like our members to have freedom when they're given the opportunity to nominate episodes or vote for them. Next time, though, we're perhaps doing something even stranger than that, as for the second time in Bring Back V10's history, we're going hybrid.